No one expected it. When South African President Cyril Ramaphosa publicly stood beside Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the entire African Union fell silent. For the first time, a powerful voice in the South backed the defiant young leader of the West, and the world realized Africa's balance of power was shifting forever. The African Union Summit Hall buzzed with quiet conversations, polished shoes clicking on marble floors as leaders from across the continent prepared to speak. Many came with carefully chosen words, cautious not to stir controversy, especially when the subject of Ibrahim Traoré arose. The young captain from Burkina Faso had been making waves, defying world powers, refusing to bend, and calling for Africa's independence in a voice that shook the old order. Most leaders preferred silence, afraid to align too closely with him, fearing sanctions or diplomatic backlash. But when South African President Cyril Ramaphosa rose from his seat, the room shifted. Known for his measured tone and political experience, few expected him to say anything unusual. Yet, as he gripped the podium and looked across the room, his eyes carried a fire that silenced even the loudest whispers. Africa, he began slowly, his voice firm and deliberate, does not need permission to stand tall. The room stilled, eyes widening in surprise. Then came the words that would ripple across the continent. And those who defend our dignity, like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, deserve not isolation but support. Gasps broke the silence. Delegates leaned toward each other, whispering in disbelief. A few shook their heads, others nodded cautiously. But no one could ignore what had just happened. Ramaphosa had crossed a line. One no leader before him had dared to cross so openly. He had thrown his weight behind Traoré. In Ouagadougou, the news spread instantly, flooding radios, phones, and market stalls. Crowds gathered in the streets, waving flags and chanting Traoré's name with pride, as if Ramaphosa's words had validated their struggle. In that single moment, under the bright lights of the AU summit, history shifted. Traoré was no longer standing alone. Back in Burkina Faso, the reaction to Ramaphosa's declaration was electric. Crowds poured into the streets of Ouagadougou, waving the national flag alongside banners of South Africa, chanting songs of African pride. For ordinary citizens who had grown used to being ignored on the world stage, it felt like a rebirth of dignity. At last, one of our own has spoken the truth, shouted a young student, his voice breaking with emotion as his friends recorded on their phones, eager to share the moment online. Traoré himself, watching the summit from a modest office inside the presidential compound, remained quiet, his hands folded as advisors rushed in to share the news. Some were jubilant, declaring that Africa's most influential democracy had just given Burkina Faso legitimacy. Others were cautious, warning that open support from South Africa could trigger retaliation from foreign powers who would see this as a dangerous sign of African unity. Yet, as the night deepened, Traoré stepped outside into the courtyard where hundreds of supporters had already gathered with torches and drums, chanting his name in rhythm with the beat. Instead of speaking from a balcony, he walked directly into the crowd, shaking hands and embracing elders, whispering words of encouragement to the youth. Cameras captured him smiling, his voice calm but unyielding. "This is not about me. This is about Africa." The words spread like wildfire, cutting across borders, carried by social media into Nairobi, Accra, Lagos, and beyond. In the villages of Mali and Niger, people lit fires in celebration, convinced that a new chapter was unfolding. But far away in Paris, London, and Washington, the reaction was far colder. Analysts warned of a growing African bloc that could resist outside control. What began as one young soldier's defiance was now turning into a continental movement, and the world was starting to panic. The panic outside Africa quickly turned into action. Within days of Ramaphosa's support, signs of retaliation began to appear, subtle yet sharp. International banks quietly tightened restrictions on Burkina Faso's accounts, delaying transfers and freezing projects that were already underway. Shipments of fuel and medicine mysteriously stalled at ports, while aid agencies suddenly announced technical issues that cut off crucial supplies. In the north of Burkina Faso, armed groups grew bolder, launching surprise raids on villages as if someone, somewhere, had just handed them new resources. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré's ministers argued bitterly, some pushing for him to soften his stance and open back channels with foreign powers, others insisting that to bend now would destroy the very pride the people had rallied around. Traoré listened quietly, then rose from his seat and spoke with the same unshaken tone that had already carried across the continent. If Africa cannot endure hardship, then Africa will never be free. Let them test us. We will not bow. His words steadied the room. But outside, ordinary citizens already felt the weight of the invisible war. Families queued for hours at empty fuel stations. Mothers searched desperately for medicine, and merchants worried about food shortages. Yet instead of breaking, the people seemed to grow stronger. Students painted murals of Traoré and Ramaphosa side by side, under the slogan * One Africa, One Voice. * farmers vowed to double their harvests to fight shortages, while soldiers patrolled with renewed determination, often cheered by villagers offering food and water. From Lagos to Dar es Salaam, crowds marched in solidarity, chanting that Africa would no longer be a chessboard for others. But beneath this wave of unity, the shadows grew darker. Foreign operatives slipped through border towns, spreading money and whispers to division. The storm was no longer just coming. It had arrived. Across the continent, the ripple of resistance began to swell into a tidal wave. In Nairobi, thousands of young people filled Uhuru Park carrying placards that read, "Africa for Africans," while in Lagos, traders shut their markets for a day to march in solidarity, chanting Traoré's name as if he were their own. In Accra, university students lit candles on campus, calling for a new African dawn, while in Johannesburg, a mural appeared overnight. Ramaphosa and Traoré standing shoulder to shoulder, towering over two giant hands painted with the flags of France and Russia, both trying to pull them down. The message was clear. Africa was uniting not for the West, not for the East, but for itself. Inside Burkina Faso, the hardship deepened. Food prices doubled, fuel became scarce, and hospitals struggled under shortages. Yet instead of anger turning toward their leader, the people drew closer to him. Villagers arrived in the capital carrying sacks of grain as gifts for soldiers. Mothers gave up their last savings to help feed orphans, and young mechanics volunteered to repair military trucks without pay. Traoré himself spent nights walking among the people with only a small escort, his presence a quiet reassurance that he would endure the same hardships as them. His defiance became their defiance, his resilience their shield. Meanwhile, in Paris and Washington, analysts grew anxious, warning their governments that crushing Traoré might spark a wildfire of rebellion across Africa. And in Moscow, Putin's envoys sent cold reports that Burkina Faso had not only resisted but inspired others to reject outside orders. For the first time in decades, Africa was not bending, it was rising. Yet in the shadows, powerful hands still plotted. Foreign-backed militias gathered strength in the north, waiting for the moment to strike hard. Everyone sensed it. The true test had yet to come. The breaking point came not with speeches but with fire. Armed militias, heavily supplied and coordinated, stormed villages in northern Burkina Faso, believing they would crush resistance within hours. Instead, they were met with an uprising unlike anything the region had ever seen. Farmers left their fields to fight alongside soldiers. Hunters with old rifles and even bows stood shoulder to shoulder with trained battalions, and women formed supply chains, carrying water and food to the front lines. Videos flooded social media. Barefoot children waving flags of Burkina Faso and chanting, "Africa will never kneel," as smoke rose in the distance. In Ouagadougou, the capital shook with defiance as Traoré, still in his dust-stained uniform from the battlefield, stepped onto the palace balcony. His voice carried raw, unpolished power. They thought we would surrender to fear, but we are not afraid. We are Africa's sons and daughters, and today, we choose our destiny. The roar of the crowd below thundered through the night, echoed across radios, phones, and televisions throughout the continent. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, people repeated his words as if they were their own. Leaders who had once stayed silent began to shift. Mali and Niger formally declared a defense pact with Burkina Faso, while movements in Ghana, Tanzania, and Kenya demanded their government stand with him. The great powers had expected his defiance to end in collapse, but instead, they had awakened something greater. A united front, a continent finding its voice after generations of silence. By dawn, Ouagadougou was alive with chants, murals, and music, the city transformed into a beacon for millions. The storm had not broken Traore. It had crowned him as a symbol of Africa's awakening. And as the sun rose, one truth could no longer be denied. Africa would never be the same again if this story shook you. Don't forget to like, comment, and share to spread the truth. Subscribe now to Faso Histories for more powerful stories of Africa's struggle, unity, and hope.